October 12, 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of the American prisoner of war facility, carrying 37 Japanese soldiers who had surrendered on Peleliu 3 weeks earlier. They sat in silence, backs rigid despite their exhaustion, each man wrapped in the private shame of survival. In the Imperial Japanese Army, capture was not merely defeat, it was erasure. They had been taught since basic training that death was preferable to the dishonor of imprisonment, that a true soldier would choose the grenade or the bayonet over the humiliation of raising empty hands to the enemy. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto stared at his boots, caked with coral dust and dried blood. He had been a machine gunner in the 14th Division, part of the garrison that had held the ridges until American flamethrowers and tank fire made continued resistance not brave, but simply impossible. When his lieutenant had fallen, when ammunition had run out, when the choice became surrender or watch his remaining men burn alive in a sealed cave, he had made the decision that would haunt him forever. He had walked out with his hands raised, expecting immediate execution. The Americans had given him water instead. The truck stopped. Guards opened the rear gate and gestured for them to dismount. Yamamoto noticed immediately that these guards carried rifles, but kept them slung over their shoulders. No bayonets fixed, no aggression in their postures. They spoke in calm voices, their words incomprehensible, but their tone matter-of-fact, almost bored. This was routine for them. Processing defeated enemies was just another duty, like kitchen patrol or filing reports. The prisoners were led into a processing building where American soldiers sat behind tables with typewriters and folders. One by one, each Japanese soldier was photographed, given a number, and asked basic questions through an interpreter, a Nisei soldier whose Japanese carried a California accent that made some of the prisoners blink in confusion. Name, rank, unit, hometown. The Americans wrote everything down with careful precision, as if these details mattered, as if the prisoners were still human beings with histories and identities, rather than disgraced casualties to be forgotten. Yamamoto answered the questions mechanically, his voice barely above a whisper. He gave his name, his rank, the designation of his unit. He did not mention that his father had been a schoolteacher in Hiroshima, or that his younger sister wrote poetry, or that he had once hoped to study engineering in Tokyo. Those things belonged to a person who no longer existed. He was nobody now, a shadow, a man who had broken the warrior code and lived. After processing, the prisoners were taken to a medical examination area. American doctors and medics checked them for wounds, diseases, malnutrition, and parasites. Yamamoto watched as a young American medic cleaned and bandaged the infected coral cuts on another prisoner's legs, working with focused concentration, his touch professional but not unkind. The medic said something in English, his tone reassuring, then gave the prisoner 2 white pills and a cup of water. The prisoner hesitated, suspecting poison, but swallowed them anyway. What did it matter now? When Yamamoto's turn came, the doctor examined the shrapnel wound in his shoulder that had been hastily treated in the field 3 weeks ago. The American made a disapproving sound, then called over a nurse who cleaned the wound properly and applied fresh bandages. The doctor said something to the interpreter, who turned to Yamamoto. He says you will need to have the shrapnel removed surgically. It will be scheduled within the next few days. They will use anesthesia. You will not feel pain. Yamamoto stared at the interpreter, unable to process this information. Surgery, anesthesia, for a prisoner, for someone who should already be dead. The medical examinations completed, the prisoners were led across the compound toward the barracks that would house them. Yamamoto observed everything with the trained eye of a soldier, noting the layout of the camp, the positions of the guard towers, the height of the fences, the spacing between buildings. Escape would be impossible, but even if it were possible, where would they go? They were thousands of miles from Japan, in the middle of America, in a country so vast and rich that even its prison camps seemed better organized than Japanese military bases. The barracks were long wooden structures, recently painted, with glass windows and screen doors. Not the bamboo cages they had expected, not the open pits used for prisoners in the Pacific Theater. Actual buildings with walls and roofs and floors. The guards opened the doors and gestured for them to enter. Inside, Yamamoto stopped so suddenly that the man behind him nearly collided with his back. The barracks were lined with iron frame beds, each with a thin mattress. But it was not the beds themselves that caused his paralysis. It was what lay upon them. On each bed sat a neatly folded stack consisting of 2 white sheets, one gray wool blanket, and a pillow in a white cotton case. Clean, crisp, new. Yamamoto turned to the interpreter, his voice tight with confusion. "There has been a mistake." The interpreter raised an eyebrow. "What kind of mistake?" "These quarters. They are for officers, yes? American officers who are prisoners?" The interpreter shook his head. "These are your quarters. This is where you will sleep. But the sheets, the pillows. Standard issue for all prisoners of war in American custody. You will also receive toiletries, towels, and a change of clothing." Yamamoto looked at the other prisoners, seeing his own disbelief reflected in their faces. Private Hideo Tanaka, a boy of 19 who had lied about his age to enlist, reached out tentatively to touch one of the pillows, then jerked his hand back as if burned. "This cannot be real," Tanaka whispered. "This is some kind of trick." But it was not a trick. The guards left them to select their bunks and settle in, and each man found himself standing beside an iron bed frame with clean linens, struggling to reconcile what he saw with everything he had been taught about the American enemy. In the Imperial Army, even officers often slept on thin mats on bare ground. Common soldiers received nothing but a space to lie down, and perhaps a blanket if the supply chain permitted. The idea that enemy prisoners, the lowest and most shameful category of humanity, would receive bedding superior to what Japanese soldiers were given, seemed impossible. It violated the entire structure of the universe as they understood it. Yamamoto sat on his assigned bed, the mattress yielding slightly under his weight. It was thin, probably stuffed with cotton or straw, but it was a mattress. He touched the pillow, feeling the softness of the cotton casing. He picked it up and held it, this small white object that represented something he could not articulate. The pillow was clean. It smelled of soap and sun-drying. It had been laundered specifically for their arrival. Someone had washed it, dried it, and placed it here. For them. For prisoners who had tried to kill Americans just weeks ago. That night, after a meal of beef stew, bread, butter, and coffee, portions larger than what Yamamoto had eaten in a single day during the POWs campaign, he lay down on the bed and pulled the sheet and blanket over himself. The pillow cradled his head. The mattress supported his back. For the first time in months, he was neither cold nor lying on hard ground. Around him in the darkness, he could hear the breathing of the other prisoners, some already asleep, some lying awake like himself, everyone processing the cognitive dissonance of the day. Private Tanaka's voice came from the next bunk, barely audible. "Corporal Yamamoto, are you awake?" "Yes." "Do you think they will take these things away tomorrow? Do you think this is just for the first night?" "I do not know. My brother is in the Navy, was in the Navy. I do not know if he is alive, but he wrote to me once about conditions on the ships. Crowded, hot, men sleeping in shifts, because there was not room for everyone to lie down at once. And we are prisoners, and we have pillows." Yamamoto had no answer. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind would not quiet. He thought about the propaganda films he had seen before deployment, the ones that showed Americans as soft and decadent, weakened by luxury, lacking the spiritual strength of Japanese warriors. He thought about the officers who had told them that Americans were cowards, who would break and run when faced with determined resistance. He thought about the entire narrative structure that had sustained him through training and combat, the story that made suffering meaningful and death glorious. That narrative was disintegrating, one clean sheet at a time. The next morning, the prisoners were awakened not by shouting or violence, but by a bell. They dressed in the clean work clothes that had been distributed the previous evening, blue denim trousers and shirts stenciled with PW in white letters. They were taken to a mess hall, where breakfast consisted of oatmeal with sugar and milk, scrambled eggs, toast, jam, and coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute that had been standard in the Imperial Army. The portions were generous. No one left hungry. After breakfast, they were assembled in a yard where an American officer, speaking through the interpreter, explained the rules of the camp. Prisoners were expected to work. They would be assigned to labor details, mostly agricultural work or maintenance tasks. They would be paid a small wage in camp currency that could be used at the canteen to purchase tobacco, candy, writing materials, and other small items. They would receive 3 meals per day. They would have access to medical care. They would be allowed to send and receive mail, subject to censorship. They would not be beaten or tortured. Any prisoner who attempted escape would be recaptured and punished with solitary confinement, but not executed. Any prisoner who assaulted a guard or another prisoner would face disciplinary action. Otherwise, they would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Yamamoto listened to this recitation with a growing sense of unreality. The Geneva Conventions. He had heard of them, vaguely, as some kind of Western agreement about warfare that Japan had never fully ratified. The specifics were mysterious, but apparently they included provisions about bedding and meals and wages for prisoners. The Americans were following rules. They had rules for everything, even for how to treat captured enemies. Over the following days, the routine of the camp became established. Yamamoto was assigned to a work detail that harvested potatoes on a nearby farm. The work was hard, but not cruel. The guard supervised, but did not abuse. At midday, the workers received lunch, sandwiches and fruit brought out to the field in insulated containers. At the end of the day, they returned to camp, washed in showers with hot water and soap, and ate dinner in the mess hall. And every night, Yamamoto returned to his bunk with its clean sheets and pillow. The cognitive dissonance did not fade. It intensified. Each small comfort, each mundane indication of systematic organization, each evidence that their care had been planned and budgeted and implemented not as special mercy but as standard procedure, undermined the worldview that had sustained the prisoners through their military service. Private Tanaka brought it up one evening as they sat outside the barracks in the late October twilight, wrapped in their issue blankets against the Wisconsin cold. "They have everything," Tanaka said quietly. "That is the truth we are learning. They have so much of everything that they can afford to give even their prisoners more than we gave our own soldiers." Sergeant Masao Fujita, a veteran of the China campaigns who had maintained strict silence since capture, finally spoke. "I have been thinking about the logistics," he said. "The planning required. They did not just decide to treat prisoners well. They built camps before they had prisoners to fill them. They manufactured thousands of beds, mattresses, sheets, pillows, blankets. They established supply chains to deliver food, medicine, clothing. They trained guards and administrators and interpreters. They created an entire system, while also fighting a war on two fronts," another prisoner added. "While also supplying their own military, while also producing ships and planes and tanks and ammunition." The implications hung in the air, unspoken, but understood. The United States had industrial capacity so vast that it could simultaneously wage global war and maintain prison camps that were better equipped than Japanese military bases. This was not just wealth. This was organizational capability on a scale that Japan had never achieved and perhaps never could achieve. Yamamoto thought about the propaganda, about the narrative of American weakness and decadence. A nation that could afford to give prisoners pillows was not weak. It was the opposite of weak. It was so strong, so secure in its power, that it could absorb the cost of humane treatment for thousands of enemy captives without even flinching. The pillows were not mercy. They were a side effect of abundance. In December, Yamamoto's shoulder surgery was performed at the camp hospital. He was given a clean gown, taken to an operating room that smelled of disinfectant, and administered anesthesia by an American doctor who told him, through the interpreter, to count backwards from 100. Yamamoto reached 93 before the darkness took him. When he woke, the shrapnel was gone, the wound was stitched, and he was in a recovery ward with white walls and nurses who checked his pulse and temperature every few hours. He remained in the hospital for 4 days. He received pain medication on a schedule. He was served meals in bed. A nurse showed him how to do exercises to prevent his shoulder from stiffening during recovery. On the 3rd day, an American chaplain visited, a kind-faced man who spoke no Japanese but sat with him for 10 minutes anyway, offering silent companionship that somehow transcended language. When Yamamoto returned to the barracks, his bunk was exactly as he had left it. The sheets had been changed in his absence. Someone had laundered them and remade the bed, preparing for his return. This small gesture, this evidence of continued care even when he was not present to witness it, affected him more deeply than he expected. The system did not require his observation to function. It operated according to its own internal logic, its own standards of baseline treatment. Winter settled over Wisconsin with a severity that none of the prisoners had experienced before. They came from a country where winter meant cool temperatures and perhaps some snow in the mountains. Not the bone-deep cold of the American Midwest, but the camp adapted. The prisoners received warmer clothing, heavy coats, and knit caps and wool gloves. The barracks were heated with coal stoves that guards stoked throughout the night. Work details shifted to indoor tasks, equipment repair and woodworking in heated workshops. The Americans had planned for winter. They had anticipated the needs of prisoners who would be unaccustomed to such cold and had made provisions accordingly. On Christmas Day, the camp served a special meal: turkey with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. The prisoners did not celebrate Christmas, knew nothing of its significance, but they recognized abundance when they saw it. This was not standard rations. This was celebration food, and somehow the celebration included them. Some of the guards taught the prisoners a card game after the meal, the Americans laughing at their own inability to communicate the rules, and the Japanese laughing at their own confusion. And for a few hours, the war seemed very far away. It was during that winter that Yamamoto began to understand the fundamental difference between the two nations at war. Japan had asked its soldiers to endure suffering as proof of virtue, to find meaning in deprivation, to demonstrate spiritual strength through material sacrifice. The Imperial Army had treated hardship as purifying, had made a philosophy out of scarcity. Commanders spoke constantly of spirit overcoming matter, of willpower transcending physical limitation, of the Japanese soul being tempered like steel through adversity. But America had taken the opposite approach. America had built a system that assumed abundance, that planned for plenty, that considered adequate food and shelter and medical care not as luxuries to be earned, but as baseline requirements to be met. And that system extended even to prisoners, even to enemies, even to men who had fought against American soldiers just months earlier. The pillows and sheets were not anomalies. They were evidence of an underlying principle, a foundational assumption about how systems should be organized and how human beings should be treated. The Americans had not given the prisoners pillows because they were generous or soft-hearted. They had given them pillows because their logistics system included pillows in the standard allocation for prisoners of war. And the logistics system had been designed with the assumption that there would be sufficient manufacturing capacity to provide those pillows, and that assumption had proven correct. In March 1945, news began to filter into the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts that the prisoners were allowed to access. American forces had landed on Iwo Jima. American bombers were striking Japanese cities with increasing frequency and devastating effect. American submarines had essentially destroyed the Japanese merchant fleet, cutting the home islands off from resources and supplies. The war was going badly for Japan, and everyone in the camp knew it. Some prisoners sank into depression, mourning for families they might never see again, for a homeland that was being slowly destroyed. Others maintained a stoic silence, enduring this final humiliation with the same grim determination they had shown on the battlefield. But some, like Yamamoto, found themselves thinking uncomfortable thoughts. They began to wonder whether Japan could have ever won this war, not just militarily but philosophically. They began to suspect that the conflict had been decided not by courage or tactics or willpower, but by industrial capacity and organizational systems, by the unsexy logistics of supply chains and manufacturing output and systematic planning. They began to realize that a nation that could afford to give its prisoners pillows could also afford to build 10 ships for everyone that Japan built, to produce 100 planes for everyone that Japan produced, to equip and supply armies across 2 oceans simultaneously without running short of anything. The pillows were not mercy. They were a message. They said, "We have so much that we can afford to care for you. We have so much that your defeat was inevitable. We have so much that we never doubted the outcome." Yamamoto lay on his bunk one April evening, his head on the white pillow that had been laundered and returned to him weekly for 6 months, and tried to imagine what Japan would have done if the situation had been reversed. If American prisoners had been taken to Japan in comparable numbers, would they have received sheets and pillows? Would they have received adequate food, medical care, heated barracks? He knew the answer. He had seen how the Imperial Army treated its own soldiers, expecting them to endure cold and hunger and disease as tests of character. He could imagine how it would treat captured enemies who were considered to have forfeited their humanity through the act of surrender. The shame of survival, which had crushed him in the early days of captivity, began to evolve into something more complex. It was still shame, but now it was mixed with a terrible clarity, a clear-eyed understanding of what he had been part of and what he had fought for. He had served an empire that had mistaken cruelty for strength, that had confused suffering with virtue, that had believed spirit could overcome material reality. He had been told that Japan's divine mission and warrior spirit would compensate for industrial inferiority. He had been lied to, or rather, he had been told a story that his commanders genuinely believed, a story that turned out to be catastrophically false when confronted with the reality of American production capacity. The war in Europe ended in May. The camp celebrated with another special meal and an outdoor gathering where guards and prisoners both expressed relief that at least one front of the global conflict had concluded. The European war had seemed distant and abstract to the Japanese prisoners, but its end meant that American resources and attention could now be fully concentrated on the Pacific. If there had been any remaining hope that Japan might negotiate a favorable peace, it died with Germany's surrender. In July, whispers began to circulate about a new weapon, something that had destroyed an entire Japanese city in a single moment. The prisoners did not believe it at first. No weapon could do that. It was propaganda, psychological warfare meant to break their spirits. But then, another city was destroyed, and then Japan surrendered, and the radio confirmed that 2 bombs of unprecedented and terrifying power had forced the emperor himself to end the war. The prisoners gathered in silence to hear the emperor's radio address broadcast through the camp's speakers, his voice thin and formal, as he announced the surrender in language so archaic and ceremonial that some of the younger prisoners struggled to understand it. Japan had accepted the unacceptable. The war was over. They had lost. In the barracks that night, men wept. Some from relief that the killing had ended. Some from grief for what had been lost. Some from emotions too complicated to name, too tangled to separate. Yamamoto sat on his bunk, the pillow in his hands, and felt something break inside him, some final resistance to reality. Japan had lost the war not because its soldiers lacked courage, not because its spirit was insufficient, but because it had fought an enemy that could develop and deploy atomic bombs, while also ensuring that prisoners of war thousands of miles from any battlefield slept on clean sheets with pillows. The scale of the disparity was so vast as to be almost meaningless. It was not a gap that could be bridged by trying harder, or believing more strongly, or sacrificing more deeply. It was a fundamental difference in capacity, in organization, in the ability to harness resources and apply them systematically toward defined objectives. Japan had fought with the tools and systems and philosophical frameworks of the early 20th century. America had fought with something else entirely, a kind of industrial and organizational modernity that Japan had not even fully understood existed until it was too late. Over the following months, as the camp prepared for the repatriation of prisoners back to Japan, Yamamoto watched the process unfold with the same attention to detail that had characterized everything else in his captivity. The Americans created lists, organized transportation, processed paperwork, coordinated with Japanese authorities who were themselves operating under American occupation, arranged medical examinations to ensure everyone was healthy enough to travel. They did not simply throw open the gates and tell the prisoners to find their own way home. They planned and executed the repatriation with the same systematic efficiency they had applied to everything else. Before departure, each prisoner received a final medical check, a package of food for the journey, and a written record of his treatment in American custody. Yamamoto stared at his document, typed on clean paper with official stamps, a bureaucratic artifact that proved he had existed, that his time here had been recorded and documented. In the chaos that was surely engulfing post-surrender Japan, this piece of paper might be the only proof he had of where he had been and what he had done since the moment he had raised his hands on Peleliu. The night before his departure, Yamamoto lay on his bunk one last time, his head on the pillow that had been provided on his first night in the camp and had been washed and returned to him weekly for more than a year. He thought about the soldier he had been when he arrived, the man who had expected immediate execution and had received bedding instead. He thought about everything he had learned, not from lectures or interrogations, but from pillows and sheets and hot showers and medical care and Christmas dinners, from the 1,000 small indicators of a system that planned for abundance rather than scarcity. He did not know what kind of Japan he would return to. He did not know if his family had survived the bombings and the privations of the war's final months. He did not know if there would be a place for men like him, prisoners who had lived when they should have died, soldiers who had learned uncomfortable truths about their nation and its enemies. But he knew that he could never again believe the simple stories about spirit and destiny and inevitable victory. He had seen the truth. He had slept on it, quite literally, every night for 13 months. The next morning, Yamamoto and his fellow prisoners were loaded onto buses for the first leg of their journey home. As the bus pulled away from Camp McCoy, he looked back at the barracks one last time, at the long wooden buildings with their glass windows and clean lines, at the guard towers and the fences that had held him for more than a year. He did not feel gratitude exactly. The Americans had not been kind out of kindness. They had been systematically humane because their system required it, because their abundance permitted it, because their organizational philosophy assumed it as a baseline condition. But he felt something. Recognition, perhaps. A bone-deep understanding that Japan had fought an enemy it had never truly seen, had waged war against a nation whose real power lay not in its weapons, but in its capacity to manufacture weapons indefinitely, not in its soldiers, but in its ability to train and equip and supply soldiers across global distances, not in its will to fight, but in its infrastructure to sustain fighting for as long as necessary without exhausting itself. The pillows had been a message all along, written in the language of logistics and industrial capacity. Yamamoto had simply needed a year of sleeping on one to learn how to read it. The message said that America's strength was not in making its soldiers suffer more, or endure more, or sacrifice more than their enemies. America's strength was in not having to ask that of them in the first place, in building a system so abundant and so well organized that even its enemies could be cared for according to decent standards while the war was still being fought and won. As the bus carried him away from Camp McCoy toward the port where a ship waited to take him across the Pacific, Yamamoto understood that he was returning to a Japan that would have to learn the same lesson his captivity had taught him. The future belonged not to nations that glorified suffering, but to nations that created systems to minimize it, not to empires that demanded sacrifice, but to societies that generated abundance, not to military cultures that treated cruelty as strength, but to organizational systems that treated basic human dignity as an engineering problem to be solved through sufficient resources and proper planning. He had learned this lesson from a pillow, from 2 clean white sheets changed weekly, from meals that arrived on schedule and medical care that was provided as standard procedure. The Americans had won the war before it started, he realized now. They had won it when they built the factories that could produce pillows for prisoners, while simultaneously producing everything else an army needed. They had won it when they created logistics systems that could deliver those pillows to camps in Wisconsin, while also delivering ammunition to battlefields in the Pacific. They had won it by making abundance, not sacrifice, the foundation of their system. That was the truth Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto carried home with him from his year as a prisoner of war in America. Not hatred of his captors, not even respect, really. Just understanding. Cold, clear, undeniable understanding of what his nation had been up against, and why the outcome had never really been in doubt. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more untold perspectives from World War II, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this remarkable window into American industrial power during the war.